Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Murray, and I'd like to welcome you to the Langley Colloquium series. And before I introduce the speaker, they wanted me to remind you that the same presentation is going to be given tonight at 7:30 p.m. at the Hampton Air and Space Museum. So tell all your friends and neighbors and have a good turnout tonight at 7:30 p.m. So introducing our speaker, we are very fortunate today to have Mr. Joe Chambers here to speak with us. The title of his presentation is Modeling Flight, the Role of Dynamically Scaled Free-Flying Models in NASA's Research Programs. Joe retired from NASA Langley in 1998 after a 36-year career. He began his career in 1962 in flight dynamics research at the Langley Full-Scale Tunnel. In 1974, he became head of that branch, which included the full-scale tunnel, the Langley 20-foot vertical spin tunnel, and the related outdoor free-flying and drop model test techniques. In 1989, he became head of the Aircraft Flight Research Division. And in 1994, he was assigned to organize and manage a new group responsible for conducting systems analyses of advanced aircraft concepts and technologies to help guide NASA investments. He has served as a representative of the United States on international committees and has given invited lectures on NASA's aeronautics programs worldwide. Joe, his awards include the NASA Outstanding Leadership Medal, the Exceptional Service Medal, and the Public Service Medal. He has also received the coveted Arthur Fleming Award in 1975 as one of the 10 most outstanding civil servants for his management of the NASA stall spin research for military and civil aircraft. He is the author of over 50 technical papers and 8 books on aeronautics topics. Joe earned a BS degree from Georgia Tech and a MS degree from Virginia Tech. Now, I've known Joe for over 30 years. I was a co-op student, and he hired me as a fresh-out engineer in 1981. And he's been my branch head and my division chief, and I have to tell you that basically a rite of passage in that organization was when a new engineer had to give a paper to Joe for him to review, a technical paper, or, God forbid, get up and rehearse a technical talk for Joe and get his feedback before you were going to give an AIAA paper, something like that. So it could be a very uncomfortable experience doing that, but it was very effective, and you were always much better for going through it. And the reason was that Joe just has an outstanding ability to see the big picture, to understand what's important, and to convey that message to his audience. So he has definitely left an imprint here at NASA Langley, and numerous engineers here have Joe to thank for mentoring them. So Joe, I'm looking forward to your presentation this afternoon, and I may turn the tables on you a little bit, and when you get done, I may give you some pointers. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Joe Chambers.
Thought I'd taught you better than that, Dan. I want to thank the Colloquium Committee for inviting me out today. It's always a pleasure to come out and talk to the staff, and I'm especially excited about seeing so many young people here today. I understand the summer students are here today. Have I got a talk for you guys? No equations, all pictures, all videos, and best, no pop quiz at the end of the lecture. Free flight models. Now, Langley researchers have been using free flight models since the doors opened here back in the 20s. They've been used for a number of different applications: flutter testing, gust loads testing, ditching, water ditching, particularly in World War II, ground impact loads, etc. The subject and field that I want to talk about today is what we call flight dynamics. It basically is a field that includes stability and control of aircraft and spacecraft, applied aerodynamics, control systems, and simulation. And the specialty area I'm going to try and hit today is one of my favorites, the area of stall spin. Langley's been in this business, as you'll find out, for over 80 years. And it's a compliment to the agency that it's invested the funds and the manpower into keeping that corporate knowledge and facilities in operation for all those 80 years. It's been referred to as one of the many crown jewels in Langley's legacy. And I'd like to dedicate this to the thousands of people that have worked and supported these projects. An overview of what we're going to talk about today. When the staff would go around giving lectures to people about what was being done in flight dynamics using these models, invariably the audience's interest would turn to the models and the testing techniques, and they wanted to hear more and more about what we did. So a few years ago, we had the pleasure of putting together a special NASA publication called Modeling Flight. This is a historical review of selected NACA and NASA testing techniques and facilities from all the centers. This includes work that was not only here at Langley, but also rocket-assisted testing at supersonic speeds at Wallops, testing in ranges at Ames, and things like B-52 model launches out at Dryden. The back of the book includes a DVD which has 2.5 hours of some of the most dramatic movie scenes that I was able to put together to demonstrate these kind of tests and the applications. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to tell you how you might get one. It's available as a free download, either as an electronic book or as a PDF. And as of last week, headquarters tells me there's now been 147,000 downloads. So it's a pretty popular book. I'm going to concentrate on Langley's activities and what's taken place here. This next slide will show an outline of the presentation. I'm going to start off talking about the uniqueness of dynamic models because they involve something called dynamic scaling, which differentiates them from conventional type wind tunnel models. The second part will be a review of the historical development by the National Aeronautics Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and NASA in terms of the concepts that were brought forth and the facilities that were developed. And then the last half of the presentation are going to be a number of videos showing the highlights of applications of these techniques, and I'm sure you'll find some rather dramatic results. So let's start talking about research models. The picture on the left is what's called a conventional static wind tunnel test model. It's a Boeing 777 in the NTF facility. Models of this type are conventionally sting-mounted to an internal strain gauge balance. The tests include obtaining quantitative and very precise aerodynamic data, pressures, etc. And the focus in those tests is usually performance. I mean, that's what sells airplanes, performance. In contrast, dynamic free flight models have no restraints. They're actually capable of free flying within a wind tunnel or outdoors. The data obtained tends to be qualitative, but yet unique. And the focus in those tests are flight behavior. The kind of testing done is flight at high angles of attack, where separated flow make the analysis very complex. Can't even handle some of these conditions even today with computer technology, or stalls and spins. The free flight models are especially effective in looking at unconventional configurations like the forward swept wing X-29 shown here, or conventional configurations flying at the edge of the envelope where separated flow makes the flight condition very, very complicated. Now, the models have to follow certain procedures to be used. And if you learn nothing else from the lecture this afternoon, you youngsters, the word scaling is important. On the left is the typical Sunday afternoon recreational radio control model. And the only scaling really done in that type of procedure is the geometry, such that the model looks like the airplane. On the right, though, these dynamic models have a different objective in their use. They're used to predict or analyze conditions that occur on real airplanes. And in doing so, the principle of dynamic similitude has to be similar between the full-scale vehicle and the model. Now, I won't bore you with all the mathematics, but when you go through here and do the mathematics, it turns out that the model not only has to be geometrically scaled, but its weight has to be scaled according to certain relationships. And even more important, the mass distribution throughout the model has to be according to certain procedures and requirements. To give you some examples of how these scaling procedures result in challenges, I've put together two airplanes here, one a fighter airplane and one a general aviation airplane. And I'm indicating characteristics of the airplane and a model tested at sea level for those aircraft. Let's look at the fighter airplane first. This is an airplane with a 42-foot wingspan. If we build a 1/9 scale model, geometrically that model will have a wingspan of about 4.8 feet. If we're interested in simulating the airplane at sea level, where with a 55,000-pound weight, the model will actually scale out at about 76 pounds. It's quite heavy. Because the scaling relationships also simulate the altitude that we're trying to emulate at sea level, if we try to simulate that airplane at 30,000 feet, for example, for a stall spin study, the weight of the model goes up to 202 pounds when we test it here at sea level. So it's an extremely dense model to basically model the relative density of the aircraft in the atmosphere up at 30,000 feet. In the case of the general aviation airplane, you can see that those models tend to be quite heavy compared to the Sunday afternoon variety, as much as, for this case, 27-pound type model. Now, equally important is the fact that the scaling relationships of these very heavy models result in the models moving much quicker than the airplane. The angular velocity, for example, of a model of this 1/9 scale model of a fighter, the angular velocities will be 3 times faster than the airplane. Likewise, the general aviation airplane is about 2.5 times. Now, these things contribute 2 challenges. The first is building this model to weigh this much and still be able to absorb the impacts and crashes that are going to occur. The second is the model moves so quickly, the piloting task may have to be divided up between one or more people. One person perhaps can't control the model moving that fast. So with those thoughts behind us, basically it makes no sense to test a model saying you're going to simulate an airplane unless it does follow those scaling procedures. Now let's talk a little bit about the things that drove Langley to begin these types of tests back in the 1920s. In World War I and immediately thereafter, the tailspin was a phenomena that was unanticipated. It was deadly. The principles involved weren't very well understood, and no one really knew how to affect recovery once you got into a tailspin. And the situation was so bad in the 20s that the U.S. Navy had a series of aircraft that were really bad spinners. I want to show this video clip. This is a Boeing NB-1 observation biplane being spin tested. This is being put into an intentional spin in 1922. And these tests were conducted by the Navy. Here the airplane is put into an intentional spin. The pilot wanted to go about 2 turns and then recover. Unfortunately, the airplane had other ideas, and the airplane continues to spin for no less than about 30 turns before it hits the ground. The pilot did parachute to safety. Unfortunately, the film clip doesn't show him leaving the aircraft, but you can see the airplane basically locked into the spin. He's left the airplane by this time. But the NB-1 was a real problem for the Navy, and they made the NACA aware that something had to be done to understand this tailspin problem. The first work at Langley actually started in 1926. This picture of Langley Field, which was taken in 1935, I'm using just to orient you as to where the test took place. Now, here's the aerial view of Langley. This is Hampton up here, the King Street Bridge going into Langley, today's Langley Air Force Base up there. Located at this part of the base was a very large airship hangar. It was actually home to the Roma dirigible that had the terrible tragic crash in the Hampton Roads area back in that time frame. And it was this huge airship hangar that served as the first test site for NACA's first work in spinning. Within the 100-foot high ceiling of this building, they were able to do the very first dynamic model test. And I'm so glad we were able to preserve this film from 1926. But take a look at how this test went about. The testing technique was basically to climb to the ceiling of this building and then hand launch a model in a spinning condition where it would be caught by people on the ground, kind of like the Keystone Cops. You see the platform up near the ceiling up here. And the next scene shows the researchers changing the moments of inertia of the model by moving these mass weights along the rod. And then I guess they drew straws to figure out who had to do the climb up to the top of the building, and maybe worse yet, who had to hold the net to catch the model. So here you see some launches of the model into the net, and they used basically slow motion pictures and a timer that let them analyze the spinning motions. But that was the very first test that was done for spinning here in the United States. Now, it didn't take very long for everybody to decide that was not a very effective way to do testing. I guess the guy who had to climb the stairs especially, or maybe someone who got hit in the face by the falling model. And this work, by the way, was followed by the international crowd. The people in Britain, for example, actually copied this technique. They had a big barn over at the Royal Aeronautical Establishment at Farnborough, which they used for similar testing. Unfortunately, the barn burned down, and the British says there's got to be a better way. So the Brits began to think of other concepts. And this led to the development of spin tunnels. Now, the British actually got there first. The idea of a spin tunnel, that is, rather than have the model fall through the air, have the air pull vertically and have the model in equilibrium in front of an observer, was the way to go. The British came up with this idea, and they proceeded through some conceptual proof of concept testing. This is a model of a proof of concept model. It's a very small vertical spin tunnel. To give you an idea how small it is, here's one of the test models over here on the side. But nonetheless, it served as the proof of concept testing for their version of a spin tunnel. The airflow was vertical, and they proved that they could keep the model in equilibrium within the center of the test section. And based on the promising results, it led to a 15-foot diameter spin tunnel. And here's the British tunnel at the RAE. You can see the model in free spinning motion in that vertically rising airstream. The airflow is controlled by a controller at the side. And at the end of the test, the model fell into a grid where it could be retrieved. Here at Langley, the word went out quickly, we want one of them. So the person who was charged with building Langley a spin tunnel was Charles Zimmerman. Charlie Zimmerman was one of the most brilliant scientists to ever work for NACA and NASA. As you see here, he was a proponent of vertical takeoff aircraft. He invented the spin tunnel and a free flight tunnel, as you'll hear in a minute. When Project Mercury came along, he was one of the key figures in the space program plans. So Charlie Zimmerman was given the task of developing this 15-foot tunnel for Langley. It was basically a copy of what the British had put together. This still picture shows the test section of the Langley tunnel, and that's Charlie Zimmerman over there at the right. But in the tunnel, they could use this testing technique. Now, I'm going to stop the movie right here to tell you that in these testing techniques, there's a small flag that's stowed in the rudder of the model, such that whenever recovery controls are given, this flag floats out as a visual ID that the recovery controls have been applied. So with that technique, Langley was in the business of spin testing. It didn't take very long for the military to catch on to this, so you'll see in the between war years, things like the P-26, and then as we got into the early years of preparing for World War II, you can see a number of the aircraft that would be famous during World War II being tested in this particular tunnel. Of course, the Reports on those results got out quickly to the military long before the airplanes went into their programs. Virtually every military design, either prototype or on paper, was tested in this 15-foot spin tunnel. However, when World War II started, there was a huge jump in the weight of military aircraft, such that this particular wind tunnel did not have sufficient vertical velocity anymore. So Langley was faced with the problem of having to design a new tunnel. The 15-foot tunnel that I've just described was located in this building. A new tunnel was built, the 20-foot spin tunnel, with a higher power source, higher velocity capabilities. So at that point, this spin tunnel was dismantled, and this tunnel became operational, and is still operational today. Now, the tunnel itself came on board in 1941, and the next sequence will show pictures of testing. This is the test section was surrounded by a magnetic field, such that by tripping that field, the controls could be tripped on the model for recovery. I included this film sequence of the A-26 model just to show you that indeed there were a lot of women that worked out here in World War II. This rather attractive technician is launching the A-26 model. And at the end of the test, you can see that she'll retrieve it using this pole with a tong on the end, just like the British did many years before. Many times I've seen this film clip and wondered who her hairdresser or hairstylist were, because it was a long day at work for her. Now, today, the 20-foot spin tunnel is still in operation, still serving the country for both its for aeronautics as well as space programs. The models, of course, have changed. The aircraft have gotten much heavier. This is a typical fiberglass balsa model, much, much heavier than the early biplane balsa models that were used. And rather than magnetic fields, hobby-type radio control gear is used to trip the controls for recovery attempts. The operation of the tunnel is very similar again to what was done in the 30s. This is a launch of the F-14 Tomcat model into the vertically rising airstream. And the tunnel controller uses that rapid accelerating airspeed control to keep the model in view while the motions are filmed, including the effects of recovery controls. The 20-foot spin tunnel here at Langley has been in operation now for 72 years. Hard to believe, 72 years of service to the nation, not only as a facility, being there when it was needed, but also the expertise that is involved in manning such a facility. Been a remarkable activity. Now, after Charlie Zimmerman invented his spin tunnel, he said, what's next? What's another neat thing to do? Why don't we invent a wind tunnel that will let us evaluate stability and control of aircraft in level flight rather than vertical flight? So Charlie pursued the idea of a free flight tunnel. This was his proof of concept apparatus. Kind of a neat idea. It's a wind tunnel. Propeller is on the back of the wind tunnel, and the tunnel itself is mounted in a pivoting device which enabled the nose of the tunnel, the entrance cone of the tunnel, to be tilted downward. And in this manner, they were able to tilt the tunnel nose downward, increase the airspeed, and to the point where the model developed enough lift to take off and start flying, as it were in gliding flight. The man on the side controlled the airspeed and the tilt of the tunnel. The pilot sat behind the propeller and controlled the airplane from there. Here's a little demonstration of how it all worked. This is Charlie Zimmerman getting ready to fly the model. There's another person behind the tunnel on the other side. The nose of the tunnel is tilted down, the airspeed is increased, and you'll see the model rise up and start flying with Charlie in control and at the rear. This shows the operator on the left and Charlie on the right. Although it's hard to see, there's a very thin wire carrying control signals to the model as it flies in the tunnel. Models in those days were very rudimentary. The control system was electromagnetic, trimming devices that let them crank in a little bit of trim. And you'll note, as a result of this scaling dilemma that I mentioned earlier, that the controls used were full on or full off to be able to combat the rapid motions of the model. So here's a typical control input resulted in bang-bang type controls. You can also see the trimmer working on the elevator. Charlie's proof of concept terribly impressed Langley management, and they gave him a green light to proceed with a new free flight tunnel, known as the Langley 12-foot free flight tunnel in 1939. That wind tunnel was built in a sphere, not for vacuum purposes, but to enable the airflow to remain constant as the tunnel tilted up and down. Again, the propeller at the rear end, and as the air circulated back through the test section could be tilted up and down. Here is the 12-foot free flight tunnel in action. This is the exterior view showing the sphere. It's over in the East Air Force side of the base today. This little scale model shows you how it was put together. If you look carefully, you can see a pilot's position right in front of the propeller there. And you can see the model depicted in flight within the test section. They had both nose up and nose down tilt capability to be able to use powered models if they so desired. You see where the tunnel operator was positioned, and speed and tilt were controlled basically by two operators. The pilot was situated in front of the tunnel fan in an enclosed cockpit where he could best look up at the model in flight. This was the pilot's position. Primarily used, again, full-on, full-off type controls. The technicians here are readying a model of the McDonnell XP-88. You can see a fairly large model in that 12-foot test section, showing the control system on the model. Jimmy Doolittle once toured this facility and said, "This is the damnedest thing I've ever seen." He couldn't believe that they were getting paid to do this. Here's a typical sequence. The nose of the tunnel is being tilted downward. The airspeed is being increased. Wings produce enough lift to take off. And you can see the head of the pilot down here beneath the canopy. Relatively good, stable flying airplane. All through World War II, this tunnel was used heavily to evaluate unconventional airplanes, flying wings. A number of Jack Northrop's designs were tested here, as well as all of our first-line fighter-type aircraft. Here's a very nice flying model, and at the end of the flight, you can see the airplane land. Now, after serving for about 25 years of flight testing, when NASA was formed, an opportunity came forth to move the entire free flight technique from this relatively small 12-foot wind tunnel down the street to the Langley full-scale tunnel, which had a 30 by 60-foot test section and could accommodate much larger models as well. Oops, didn't mean to do that. The free flight technique kind of reached its maturity over to the full-scale wind tunnel. And in its most recent days, this shows a sketch of the test setup that was used in that facility. Again, the test section measured 60 feet across by 30 feet high. This shows a typical model in flight, and the cable you see coming into the top of the model brings forth compressed air, which was used to power the model, and also controls signals from the pilots as well as the flight control computer that simulated the flight control system. Piloting duties were divided up. One person flew thrust, one pitch. The person flying roll and yaw was situated in the exit cone of the tunnel looking up the rear end of the model. And you can see that there was a safety cable operator whose job it was to pull the model out in the event of loss of control during the flight. During those years, the facility, as you'll see in some of our highlights, played a yeoman's job in the advancement of flight techniques. I want to show a typical flight. This shows our moderator, Mr. Dan Murray, as well as Mark Kroom in the audience. During some flight testing of the blended wing body configuration, gives an idea what the last few tests, free flight tests in the facility look like. This was a large model. You can see the vane on the nose of the model being used for control feedbacks and the sophistication of the flight testing. The models, by the way, were not only flown, but they were also tested on the conventional Sting to measure aerodynamic data, so it was possible to correlate flight motions with the aerodynamic parameters involved. Now, outdoor free flight techniques. The free flight wind tunnel techniques told us at the stall an airplane may go out of control. The spin tunnel, because the models were thrown in by hand, says there'll be a spin, but what's left out is can the airplane reach that spin mode from conventional flight. And that holds true for quite a few airplanes. They can't be flown deeply enough to reach that spin. And more importantly, what do you tell the pilot to do to keep from reaching that endpoint? So Langley invented something called the outdoor free flight technique. This gives a historical perspective of what was gone through. They started with catapult testing, trying to shoot the model off a catapult, pull the nose up and see what would happen beyond the stall into the incipient spin, but buildings were not tall enough. They couldn't get enough of the spin to get to the developed spin. So in the 50s, they started doing testing using helicopter, unpowered models dropped from helicopters. Initially, this was done at Patrick Henry, today's Patrick Henry Airport, and then it moved to West Point Airport. And as you can see, the model was dropped from a helicopter, and these ingenious guys used World War II anti-aircraft type gun platforms to track the model and fly the model. In the mid-50s, the activity was moved out to Plumtree Island and operated there for almost 40 years during the venue that developed the F-15s, F-14s, F-18s. And then in latter years, in the late 90s, the activity was moved to NASA Wallops for tests of the F-18 Super Hornet, which included water landings. I don't have time to show these things this afternoon. They're included in the DVD with the book profusely, so I'll refer you to those films as well. Very, very notable contribution. Now, to bring you up to date on these Langley facilities that were developed back in the 1930s, this picture was taken back in the 70s. This is the transonic dynamics tunnel in the east area. The full-scale tunnel was put out of service in 2009 and demolished in 2011, so it is no longer there. This is where the 15-foot spin tunnel and the first 5-foot free flight tunnel were put into operation. The 20-foot spin tunnel is still there, as is the old free flight tunnel. That tunnel has had its rotation capability or its tilt capability taken away, so it's fixed. But it is used as a university-class wind tunnel. And in fact, that wind tunnel is the oldest wind tunnel in the NASA inventory at any center, 74 years. Now, I want to switch over and talk about my favorite selected applications, chosen because I think these are the most dramatic. There's going to be 7 areas we're going to talk about: spinning, parachute technology, a general aviation program, space capsule stability, para-wing tumbling, and then accident investigation. So let's leap into these, the first being the spin mode story. I'm going to refer to flat spins and steep spins. And by flat spin, I mean the airplane is spinning with its fuselage almost horizontal. That is, it's descending vertically The fuselage is almost horizontal, almost flat. Very difficult spin to recover from because the rudder, which would usually terminate a spin, is basically parallel to the airflow. So it's pretty ineffective once you get into that type of spin. Also, as the airplane spins flat, it tends to rotate about the center of gravity. Now, for some aircraft, and you see an example of that later when I talk about an accident, if the cockpit is very far forward, you'll get an effect similar to a merry-go-round where the cockpit is subjected to very high G-forces, eyeballs out, while you're in a very high rate of spin in a flat attitude. Let's take a look at some of these spin modes. I want to show you various spins that can be demonstrated by the same airplane. Just depends on how they get there. So the first one we're going to show you is this flat spin of the F4. You can see the airplane spinning very flat, very difficult to recover from. In fact, the F4 does not recover from this particular spin. It's not the only airplane with that problem. This was an F-111. And then on top of that, here's some other spins that the same airplanes exhibit. This is a second spin that the F4 has. It's a steep spin. And I'll stop the movie now. You can see that the spin axis is actually off the nose of the airplane. It's spinning about an axis somewhere off here. Completely different than the flat spin. The F4 also has a third spin mode, just to further confuse the pilot, which is called the oscillatory steep spin. And you can see the hesitations and roll here, which ought to be thoroughly disorienting to a pilot. Not to be outdone, the F-111 has an oscillatory spin. And then here's my favorite of all time in terms of disorienting spins. This is the A-7 fighter. And if you can recover from that, you're one hell of a pilot. So one of the features of our testing in the facility is to identify these different type of spins, make sure the pilots are aware before they ever go up to spin test the first airplane of what they might run into. Second area I want to talk about is parachute technology. Now, the staff at the spin tunnel has expertise in not only what is the minimum size parachute that you have to put on an airplane to recover it if it's in one of these spins without aerodynamic effectiveness. They also have expertise in the mechanics of getting the parachute out, and equally important, once you've recovered, letting the parachute go. That's pretty important too. So they've developed that technology. The problem isn't quite as simple as it might seem. For example, just the effect of the bridle line length up to the parachute. If you design the parachute correctly, the parachute will inflate, give a retarding moment in yawing and stop the spin. The nose of the airplane will come down and you can recover to conventional flight. If the bridle length is too short, the dead air over the airplane as it's descending in a spin will suck that parachute in, and it will just flop over the airplane and have no effect on the spin. Likewise, if it's too far, the bridle length is too long, the parachute will drift over to the spin axis, and it'll gaily spin around with the airplane. So let me show you some movies now that show the effects of these spinning motions. Here's an F4 whose spin chute riser line is too short. You can see the parachutes dropping back into the dead air. And if you want to make an F-14 pilot mad, just put a parachute on his airplane that's going to collapse and lay on top of the airplane while he's trying to recover from a spin. This is about as bad as it gets. Here's one with a bridle line that's too long. The parachute comes out, it inflates, and then it drifts over to the spin axis and said, this is fun. And in the meantime, the pilot can't recover from the spin. Switching subjects again on you, I want to talk about free flight testing in the full-scale tunnel. There were so many, as you can imagine, 50 years of free flight testing over at that tunnel. So many things I could have picked, but I wanted to highlight a few of these. Upper left, the X-15. When they were designing the X-15, a major question came about the wing design. Are we going to need ailerons or not? The people here at Langley had come up with the idea of using differentially deflected horizontal tail for roll control. and were adamant that we don't need ailerons because there was going to be a huge design problem with heating and actuators and what have you on the wing of that airplane. So it all came down to the actual X-15 design crew coming to Langley to observe free flight test in the full-scale tunnel, where it was demonstrated that the airplane could be controlled with a differential tail. And that's the way the airplane was built. The X-15, the next time you're up in the Smithsonian, you'll note it has wing trailing edge flaps, but no ailerons on the wing. At the upper right, variable sweep wings, when they were first invented, again here at Langley, this is a Langley conceived concept. Models were flown in full scale to show that the trim and flying behavior of the airplane would be satisfactory. At the lower left, the Hawker P-1127, which was the daddy of the current day Marine Corps AV-8 vertical takeoff and landing airplane. The U.S. and the British engaged in common research. The British government was not going to fund this project. They felt that it was too complicated. The airplane could never transition from hovering flight to forward flight, and free flight test in the full-scale tunnel here at Langley convinced them otherwise, and they gave a green light to the project, which led to the P-1127 and the AV-8s as well. And then finally, at the lower right, a very nifty idea, again invented here at Langley, the externally blown flap. The idea being to tilt the forward part of the engine nacelles downward, these being fan-powered engines with relatively cool exhaust, and direct the fan flow up over huge trailing edge flaps to generate very high values of lift for takeoff and landing, and also placing the horizontal tail up high to avoid all of that downwash coming from that flow. And if you look at that airplane, you can see this was 1971. Today you go out and look at the Air Force inventory and you see the C-17 basically embodied a lot of the research that came out of those tests. Perhaps the real important activity in full scale had to do with flight at high angles of attack. These were fighter airplanes. When we entered the Vietnam War with the F-4 aircraft, it had not been designed for high angle of attack conditions. It was going to be a standoff missile launcher, and we lost over 100 F-4s in inadvertent stalls and spins at high angles of attack. In the 70s, virtually every new fighter aircraft was sent to Langley for testing in full scale before it ever entered this test regime in full flight. So you can see that a number of these configurations benefited from those tests, and again, this is covered in detail in the book. Now I want to show this General Aviation Spin Program because it shows you the correlation between model testing and full-scale airplane testing. In the 1970s, we had finally gotten over a surge of military aircraft, F-15, F-14, etc., and we had little time to devote to general aviation research, which at that time, over 30% of the fatalities in general aviation were related to stall spin. This program was formulated on the idea of having spin tunnel model, a radio control model, and a full-scale airplane as part of the program, and correlation of results being a prime output. The configuration included varying the tail designs as shown here. This tail number 4 was the workhorse of most of the activity. And what I'd like to do now is show you the correlation of results that were obtained from the model testing and for the airplane testing as well. This is in the spin tunnel. It shows that this airplane has a very, very steep spin, very easy to recover from. It took about 1 1/4 turns to recover, but it also had a flat spin and absolutely no recovery, just as bad as a fighter airplane. So we have those two spin modes. Now let's go outside with the radio control model, and they'll fly the model into a stall and spin, and as you can see, it enters the steep spin. And after about 4 or 5 turns, recovery controls are applied, and the spin is terminated and the model dives out of the spin. Now on another flight, we got into the steep spin, but as we stayed in the spin, this progressed into the flat spin. And you'll see here after several turns, the spin becomes noticeably faster. The nose of the model rises up, and from that point on, the pilot is flailing the control stick trying to recover, and nothing's happening. The model, of course, was equipped with a spin parachute for emergency recoveries. You can see it's in the flat spin now, and absolutely nothing is working to recover. Pilot's going to release the parachute, terminate the spin, and you can see him release the parachute here at the end of the flight. So basically, the radio control model and spin tunnel model agreed quite well. Now let's take a look at the airplane. These tests were done up at Wallops. This is Jim Patton, who was our test pilot at the time. Jim flew all of our spin tests on this particular airplane. The airplane itself, let me see if I can pause the picture. If you notice carefully, on the wingtips of the airplane, there was a movie camera embedded within the wing structure that used a mirror system to photograph back and look at tufts attached to the wing and also what the pilot was doing for additional information during the flight. And we'll look at some of those in a minute. The tests were done at Wallops, as I say, with quite a bit of instrumentation. The airplane was flown up to an altitude of 10,000 feet, where Jim put the airplane intentionally into spins. So here at 10,000 feet, Jim stalls the airplane. You can see the propeller begin to slow down, pulls the angle of attack up. Wing does a dipsy-do, and Jim kicks in pro-spin controls. And as was the case for the radio-controlled airplane, it goes into this steep spin mode, which is easily recovered. Jim is still holding pro-spin controls, and here's anti-spin controls, and you can see the airplane recover quickly. Here, Jim flies into the flat spin, and as was the case for the radio control model, not going to be a good day without a parachute. Puts the airplane into a spin to the left, and within a few turns, you can see this spin get noticeably faster. The nose of the airplane comes up. Jim is putting in recovery controls to no avail. The airplane spinning gaily away. He's trying different control manipulations at this point. And finally, he decides he's earned his civil service pay, so he deploys the parachute. And he releases the parachute to come home. Now, I'd like to show you, as part of this movie, pictures that were taken of that from the left wing camera. You can see the black tufts on top of the wing. This is before stall, so you can see the flow is attached, and you can see Jim in the cockpit there. Watch what happens to the tufts once the airplane is stalled, and I'll bring your attention to Jim in a minute. Here he pulls the nose up. The wing stalls. You can see the tufts are saying, what happened to the air? And here's his first turn of the spin. The airflow of the wing, of course, is completely disrupted at this point. Now, Jim's going to go through his recovery procedure repertoire here. Here's one attempt, nothing happening. At one point, we told Jim, take your hands off the control. He's not praying there. He just took his hands off the control. Nothing happened. So Jim tried a few more things, pumping the stick back and forth. And seeing terra firma coming up, he decides to pull the spin chute and get the heck out of there. Watch the tufts reattach quickly. There we go. We're flying again now. He releases the chute from that point. These were obviously hazardous type tests. You can see the marks on the side of the cockpit of the number of times that Jim used that parachute. Actually, he used it 16 times. These pictures were taken a little early, but the chute was successful 16 times in terminating that spin. Quite a remarkable comment on the expertise of the people that were involved in that work. Bottom line was the correlation between all the tests were very good. Now let's turn from airplanes to spacecraft for a minute. It wasn't very long into the Mercury project that people found out that things with blunt bottoms don't fly very well during re-entry and recovery. And the spin tunnel was the site of a number of tests: Project Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and also some more recent bodies for testing. And some of these instabilities are quite remarkable. This movie will show you, both for Mercury and Apollo, the kind of instabilities that were encountered. Here's an early version of the Mercury capsule into the vertically rising airstream. And this is a heck of a way to come back from a space mission without your seasickness or air sickness pills. If the capsule got turned over too far by its oscillations, it did this little winky-dinky thing. Apollo, the capsule showed instability in flight. It would trim nose down. So the issue here was how to attach parachutes to keep these rascals under control during recovery. They tried a number of attachment points. The first was a single attachment point. As you can see, this didn't work very well. Capsule still had wild oscillations. Finally, when they used multiple bridles, you can see it stabilized the capsule quite well. The spin tunnel has continued to work this kind of technology in recent programs as well. This is a planetary probe model with extreme stability. It's remarkable with that particular shape. And one of the researchers reaches in with a long pole and disturbs it just to show how stable it is. No oscillations whatsoever once it damped out. This one, with a slightly different shape, has residual oscillations. And then here's a quick clip of some of the activity that went on under the Constellation banner, showing the capsule escape tower first. And a second scene that will show the Orion capsule stabilized with parachutes. The next topic I want to talk about, 6 out of number 7, is the NASA Parawing research that occurred here back in the 60s and the 70s. Parawing, of course, as most of you know, was invented by Francis Rogallo, who was a scientist here at Langley. His applications range from providing additional lift with a stowable, flexible wing for high-performance aircraft for landing and takeoff, rapid deployment utility vehicles, and, of course, trying to enhance cross-range capability for spacecraft. None of those really worked out, except if you go down to Nag's Head, you'll see these all over the place, of course, for recreational vehicles. I do want to show you a bit of research that was done here, which was extremely significant for Parawing vehicle design, and that has to do with the fact that depending on the center of gravity location, these vehicles can tumble. This is a propeller-powered utility Parawing vehicle. You can see they're checking the model out, giving nose down control, no right roll control, and so forth, checking it out prior to flight. And then I want to demonstrate, they'll demonstrate flights in which they had satisfactory stall recovery and then tumbling occurring in flight. The first two shots are going to show satisfactory stalls and recoveries. This is kind of a climb to zero airspeed hammerhead type stall. And you can see the nose coming down. There's some luffing of the material as it reaches zero angle of attack, but the vehicle is recovered. A second flight, again showing satisfactory recovery. Now, following this flight, the researchers moved the center of gravity back to assess what would happen at a rearward CG for this particular airplane. And as you can see in the next two sequences, the stall recoveries involve tumbling, which is a very bad day. Here the airplane is flown to 0 speed, and in the recovery process, you can see it goes nose over tail tumbling. Just enough energy to keep it tumbling, and no control to recover the vehicle. And one more shot, just showing again a 0 airspeed stall, nose down for recovery, luffing of the material, and rapid tumbling. Very useful information for the parawing community, and they did quite a bit of traveling here to Langley to witness these types of tests. I have one more application I want to talk about. Involves accident investigations and perhaps one of the most beautiful airplanes ever designed, the XB-70. This was Ship 1. There were 2 XB-70s built. The airplane was involved in a fatal accident. Ship 2 was out at Edwards Air Force Base back in 1966. The airplane had just completed a supersonic run for sonic boom studies for NASA, and General Electric requested formation flight time of aircraft powered by General Electric engines. So as you can see here, it was formatted with T-38 F4, a NASA F-104, and an F-5. The F-104 NASA airplane was being flown by Joe Walker, who was NASA's leading X-15 pilot. The B-70 was being flown by Al White, a test pilot from North American, and Carl Cross, a major from the Air Force who was on his first familiarization flight with the airplane. During the flight, the F-104 collided with the XB-70. The Accident Investigation Board said that Joe Walker lost sight of the downturned wingtip of the XB-70. The horizontal tail of his airplane impacted the tip of the wing of the XB-70, and in doing so, it rolled, the F-104 rolled over into the vertical tails of the XB-70, which cut the F-104 in half. Walker died instantly. Both tails were sheared off the XB-70, and the left wing panel was damaged. And I'll show you sequences from that crash. I think. Here we go. They had finished 20 minutes of formation flying for these pictures, and this was the last go-around that they were taking. The F-104 is shown here. Here you see the airplane after it's crashed into the B-70. You'll notice the vertical tails have been sheared off. The B-70, after 15 seconds of flying normally, fell away. You can see the left wingtip has been sheared off the airplane. Entered a flat spin. Now, before it entered that flat spin, Al White was able to eject from the airplane in a capsule. Both pilots had capsules that they could eject in. But the ejection sequence was such that the seat of the airplane had to be moved rearward before the capsule could be closed. The accident board requested that Langley do spin tunnel test to evaluate the loads at the cockpit area during the B-70's crash. This was the basic B-70. Two things I'd like you to note. One is the relatively slow spin rate. This is projected at full-scale speed. And the fact that the airplane is spinning off its nose, so there's not much of a load at the cockpit. And then we're going to contrast that in a minute with the airplane in a damaged state. You'll note the flatter attitude and the fast rate of spin, twice that of the basic airplane. The XB-70 was laid out such that you see it spinning about its center of gravity. The cockpit of the XB-70 is 100 feet forward of that spin axis. estimates were that the cockpit loads were about 4.5 Gs forward during that motion. And the wreckage, when it was found, indicated that the system that was a gas generator that was to move the seat rearward had in fact failed. It had not been designed for that level of Gs. So that really caused the fatality. The accident board was very grateful for Langley's test to support their conclusions. Concluding remarks. What I've talked about today is only one example of what people have called NASA at its best. It was a unique long-term investment of resources and personnel in a very, very specialized role. Nobody else in the country did this type of testing, only Langley. So the industry, the military, knew they had one-stop shopping. Come to Langley and get your needs met. There are numerous examples of critical contributions cited in the book, as well as on the videos. Now, this modeling flight book that I've talked about is available free online as an EPUB or a PDF from the Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate at headquarters. You can also obtain a hard copy from the GPO. I do want you to know that the downloadable version does not have the DVD. You'll have to go to the GPO and unfortunately pay for their book to get the DVD to go along with it. In any event, I hope that exposure to this, particularly for you young people, has been entertaining and that you found the talk interesting. Thank you.
Joe, I think we have time for several questions. So if you have your questions, please use one of the microphones in the aisle.
Thanks for coming today, sir. My name is Dave Paddock. I was wondering if you had any comments about deep stall and the how you had the full flying tail that would help with flat spinning. Is that correct?
For which aircraft?
For many general aircraft, I think. Did we do any testing with that? I know we had
They
limited exposure to
evaluate,
it.
yeah, in total. All configurations are evaluated. Flaps, leading edge slats, external stores. As you can imagine, any of these things would affect the kind of characteristics that we talked about today. So in the spin tunnel, for example, to do a fighter airplane that carries external bombs or whatever, takes months and months of testing because there's so many configurations and there's so much variety between the results, quite a bit. Any other questions? Yeah, Mike.
One of the big issues that's been coming up in aviation circles is commercial airplanes getting into conditions that the pilots aren't trained to get out of, and the simulators not being able to simulate the conditions properly, and of course we can't do it with CFD either. So I was wondering, I believe that Dan's group started working on free flight models and trying to get information that way for the simulators, and I just wondered how that's going and if it's still going.
In the book, we cover the beginning of that activity. Unfortunately, the book was published before results really started coming in, so I'll defer to Dan for an answer to that.
Well, there are folks that could answer that better than I can, but the AirStar program through the Aviation Safety Program has been doing quite a bit of flight research using UAVs, full-flying UAVs that take them into loss of control conditions and recovery, looking at ways to prevent loss of control, how to recover when loss of control happens, and then looking at different types of control strategies to help the pilot in those situations. So that work is going on through the Aviation Safety Program, and there are lots of people here in the audience that I see that could talk about that after the session today, if you'd like, Mike.
Yes, sir.
So we tore down the 30 by 60, and we locked down the 12-foot tunnel. And so we have left is the 20-foot spin tunnel. Has all that free flight testing within the tunnel, has that work kind of gone to the wayside, and we're relying now mostly on full free flight models outside of the wind tunnels?
Before the 30 by 60 was demolished, some exploratory testing was done in the 14 by 22 low-speed tunnel to demonstrate that flight tests could be done in that more confined area. Talking over with people like Dan today, one would question with micro-miniaturization of control systems, et cetera, whether we might revert back to more outdoor flying today compared to trying to do it in a wind tunnel. So you might be right. Outdoor flying may be the way to go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Todd.
Hey, during the movies, you showed the A7 Corsair in that kind of wild oscillation during the spin. Did the F8 Crusader show the same type of behavior?
No, it did not. It did not.
Even though they were so close configuration.
The eye of the beholder, I guess. You know, the kind of characteristics like mass distribution and true tail length and all this have a terrific impact on these characteristics. I kind of like the parawing thing. I think that's neat. Watch out the next time you're at NAG's Head.
Okay, Joe, well, we'd like to thank you very much for coming. In appreciation of your visit here, we have an etching of a number of flight airplanes that have been tested at NASA, so we'd like to present that to you.
Very good.
And please join me in thanking Joe for his presentation today.
Thanks, everybody, for showing up. I'll be doing exactly the same thing tonight down in Hampton, so if you have neighbors with young kids who like airplanes, tell them to come out.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Engage balance. The tests include obtaining quantitative and very precise aerodynamic data, pressures, etc. And the focus in those tests is usually performance. I mean, that's what sells airplanes, performance. In contrast, dynamic free flight models have no restraints. They're actually capable of free flying within a wind tunnel or outdoors. The data obtained tends to be qualitative, but yet unique, and the focus in those tests are flight behavior. The kind of testing done is flight at high angles of attack, where separated flow make the analysis very complex. Can't even handle some of these conditions even today with computer technology, or stalls and spins. The free flight models are especially effective in looking at unconventional configurations like the forward swept wing X-29 shown here, or conventional configurations flying at the edge of the envelope where separated flow makes the flight condition very, very complicated. Now, the models have to follow certain procedures to be used, and if you learn nothing else from the lecture this afternoon, you youngsters, the word scaling is important. On the left is the typical Sunday afternoon recreational radio control model, and the only scaling really done in that type of procedure is the geometry, such that the model looks like the airplane. On the right, though, these dynamic models have a different objective in their use. They're used to predict or analyze conditions that occur on real airplanes. And in doing so, the principle of dynamic similitude has to be similar between the full-scale vehicle and the rocket-assisted testing at supersonic speeds at Wallops, testing in ranges at Ames, and things like B-52 model launches out at Dryden. The back of the book includes a DVD which has 2.5 hours of some of the most dramatic movie scenes that I was able to put together to demonstrate these kind of tests and the applications. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to tell you how you might get one. It's available as a free download, either as an electronic book or as a PDF. And as of last week, headquarters tells me there's now been 147,000 downloads. So it's a pretty popular book. I'm going to concentrate on Langley's activities and what's taken place here. This next slide will show an outline of the presentation. I'm going to start off talking about the uniqueness of dynamic models because they involve something called dynamic scaling, which differentiates them from conventional type wind tunnel models. The second part will be a review of the historical development by the National Aeronautics Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and NASA in terms of the concepts that were brought forth and the facilities that were developed. And then the last half of the presentation are going to be a number of videos showing the highlights of applications of these techniques, and I'm sure you'll find some rather dramatic results. So let's start talking about research models. The picture on the left is what's called a conventional static wind tunnel test model. It's a Boeing 777 in the NTF facility. Models of this type are conventionally sting-mounted to an internal structure.
Outstanding civil servants for his management of the NASA stall spin research for military and civil aircraft. He is the author of over 50 technical papers and 8 books on aeronautics topics. Joe earned a BS degree from Georgia Tech and a MS degree from Virginia Tech. Now, I've known Joe for over 30 years. I was a co-op student, and he hired me as a fresh-out engineer in 1981. And he's been my branch head and my division chief, and I have to tell you that basically a rite of passage in that organization was when a new engineer had to give a paper to Joe for him to review, a technical paper, or, God forbid, get up and rehearse a technical talk for Joe and get his feedback before you were going to give an AI paper, something like that. So it could be a very uncomfortable experience doing that, but it was very effective, and you were always much better for going through it. And the reason was that Joe just has an outstanding ability to see the big picture, to understand what's important, and to convey that message to his audience. So he has definitely left an imprint here at NASA Langley, and numerous engineers here have Joe to thank for mentoring them. So Joe, I'm looking forward to your presentation this afternoon, and I may turn the tables on you a little bit, and when you get done, I may give you some pointers. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Joe Chambers.
Thought I'd taught you better than that, Dan. I want to thank the Colloquium Committee for inviting me out today. It's always a pleasure to come out and talk to the staff, and I'm especially excited about seeing so many young people here today. I understand the summer students are here today. Have I got to talk for you guys? No equations, all pictures, all videos, and best, no pop quiz at the end of the lecture. Free flight models. Now, Langley researchers have been using free flight models since the doors opened here back in the 20s. They've been used for a number of different applications: flutter testing, gust loads testing, ditching, water ditching, particularly in World War II, ground impact loads, etc. The subject and field that I want to talk about today is what we call flight dynamics. It basically is a field that includes stability and control of aircraft and spacecraft, applied aerodynamics, control systems, and simulation. And the specialty area I'm going to try and hit today is one of my favorites, the area of stall spin. Langley's been in this business, as you'll find out, for over 80 years. And it's a compliment to the agency that it's invested the funds and the manpower into keeping that corporate knowledge and facilities in operation for all those 80 years. It's been referred to as one of the many crown jewels in Langley's legacy. And I'd like to dedicate this to the thousands of people that have worked and supported these projects. An overview of what we're going to talk about today. When the staff would go around giving lectures to people about what was being done in flight dynamics using these models, invariably the audience's interest would turn to the models and the testing techniques, and they wanted to hear more and more about what we did. So a few years ago, we had the pleasure of putting together a special NASA publication called Modeling Flight. This is a historical review of selected NACA and NASA testing techniques and facilities from all the centers. This includes work that was not only here at Langley, but also
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Murray, and I'd like to welcome you to the Langley Colloquium series. And before I introduce the speaker, they wanted me to remind you that the same presentation is going to be given tonight at 7:30 p.m. at the Hampton Air and Space Museum. So tell all your friends and neighbors and have a good turnout tonight at 7:30 p.m. So introducing our speaker, we are very fortunate today to have Mr. Joe Chambers here to speak with us. The title of his presentation is Modeling Flight, the Role of Dynamically Scaled Free-Flying Models in NASA's Research Programs. Joe retired from NASA Langley in 1998 after a 36-year career. He began his career in 1962 in flight dynamics research at the Langley Full-Scale Tunnel. In 1974, he became head of that branch, which included the full-scale tunnel, the Langley 20-foot vertical spin tunnel, and the related outdoor free-flying and drop model test techniques. In 1989, he became head of the Aircraft Flight Research Division. And in 1994, he was assigned to organize and manage a new group responsible for conducting systems analyses of advanced aircraft concepts and technologies to help guide NASA investments. He has served as a representative of the United States on international committees and has given invited lectures on NASA's aeronautics programs worldwide. Joe, his awards include the NASA Outstanding Leadership Medal, the Exceptional Service Medal, and the Public Service Medal. He has also received the coveted Arthur Fleming Award in 1975 as one of the 10 most